You're going to change the world today, baby girl, just like your mama did." Those were the words Jerome Williams whispered to his 11-year-old daughter Zara as she stood in front of the bathroom mirror at 5:30 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in Detroit, carefully braiding her natural hair into two neat sections that would stay perfect for the long day ahead. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the coffee maker downstairs and the distant rumble of early morning traffic on 8 Mile Road. But Zara had been awake for 20 minutes, already staring at the ceiling and thinking about the conversation she was going to have in San Francisco later that day, a conversation that would change everything. She walked back to her bedroom, stepping carefully around the scattered notebooks and coding manuals that covered most of the floor space evidence of the late nights she spent working on the algorithms that had made her one of the youngest tech entrepreneurs in American history, though almost nobody knew that yet. On her nightstand sat a silver-framed photograph of a woman with kind eyes and a brilliant smile, her arms wrapped around a much younger Zara, both of them laughing at something just outside the camera's view. Destiny Williams had been gone for 18 months now, taken by cancer that moved through her body faster than any of the doctors had predicted. But her presence filled every corner of this modest two-bedroom house in a way that made Zara feel watched over and protected and deeply, permanently loved. "Morning, Mama," Zara said softly, touching the glass with her fingertip the way she did every morning before school, every night before bed, and every time she needed to remember who she was and where she came from and what she was capable of accomplishing. "Today's the big day, the day we finish what you started." The smell of pancakes drifted up from the kitchen along with Jerome's voice humming an old Stevie Wonder song that Destiny used to play when she was working late into the night on business plans and contract negotiations, building the small logistics company that would eventually become Williams Transport Solutions, a modest but successful operation that employed 37 people in the Detroit area and had contracts with several major automotive suppliers. Jerome had taken over the business when Destiny got sick, learning everything he could about supply chain management and customer relations, determined to keep his late wife's legacy alive while raising their brilliant daughter and somehow managing to do both with a grace that amazed everyone who knew their story. Zara packed her worn leather notebook, a gift from Destiny on her 10th birthday, its pages filled with code snippets and business ideas and letters to her mother that she wrote when the grief felt too heavy to carry alone. She folded Destiny's favorite silk headscarf, the one with the pattern of golden butterflies that her mother had worn to every important meeting, and placed it carefully in the bottom of her small backpack along with a fresh set of clothes for tomorrow. Finally, she wrapped the framed photograph in a soft cloth and nestled it between her laptop and a folder of documents that looked remarkably official for something a sixth grader was carrying, though Zara Williams was not exactly a typical sixth grader. 3 years ago, frustrated with the educational software her school was using to help students with learning disabilities, Zara had started coding her own solution in her bedroom, working with the basic programming skills her mother had taught her, and expanding from there with an intuitive understanding of how technology could be made more accessible and more human. What started as a homework helper became BrightMind, an adaptive learning platform that could identify individual students' learning patterns and adjust its teaching methods accordingly, making education more effective for children with dyslexia, ADHD, autism, and other cognitive differences that traditional classroom environments often failed to accommodate properly. The app launched quietly 2 years ago, but word spread fast through educational circles when teachers started reporting dramatic improvements in their students' engagement and comprehension. Within 6 months, BrightMind was being used in classrooms across 12 states. Within a year, it was licensed to school districts in 18 countries. And now, at 11 years old, Zara was the CEO of a company valued at $2.8 billion, though she still did her homework at the kitchen table every night and helped her father with the dishes afterward, because Destiny had raised her to understand that success never meant you were too important to take care of the people and responsibilities that mattered most. Today's trip to San Francisco wasn't about BrightMind, though. Today was about the other project Zara had been working on, the one that would fulfill the promise she'd made to her mother during those final weeks in the hospital when Destiny was too weak to speak, but still strong enough to squeeze Zara's hand when she whispered that she was going to make sure no child would ever be treated as less than worthy of respect and dignity, no matter where they came from or what they looked like or how much money their families had. "You ready for this, sweetheart?" Jerome asked as Zara came downstairs, his voice carrying the mixture of pride and protectiveness that had defined his parenting style since the day Destiny died, and he realized he was raising this extraordinary child alone. He was dressed in his best suit, the navy blue one he'd worn to Destiny's funeral and had barely touched since, but today felt important enough to mark with the kind of formal attention that his late wife would have insisted upon. Zara nodded, accepting the plate of pancakes he handed her and eating methodically while her mind ran through the presentation she'd rehearsed dozens of times, the legal documents that were already prepared and waiting for her signature, and the phone calls that would be made immediately after the meeting concluded successfully. "I'm ready, Daddy. Mama would be proud of what we're about to do." Detroit Metropolitan Airport at 7 o'clock on a Tuesday morning was exactly as busy and impersonal as every major airport in America, filled with business travelers clutching coffee cups and families juggling luggage and children, everyone moving with the particular urgency of people who had places to be and schedules to keep. Zara walked through the terminal beside her father, her small, rolling suitcase bumping along behind her, drawing no particular attention from the crowds of adults who were far too focused on their own travels to notice that the quietly composed little girl in the purple sweater and jeans might be someone worth noticing. She was dressed simply on purpose, the way Destiny had taught her to dress for important business meetings, where she wanted people to focus on her ideas rather than making assumptions based on her appearance. The purple sweater was soft cotton from Target. The jeans were from the same store, and her white sneakers were clean, but obviously well worn. The kind of practical footwear that suggested a child whose parents prioritized comfort and functionality over brand names and status symbols. The only hint of anything unusual was the small leather portfolio she carried alongside her backpack, containing documents that most adults would find impressive and more than a little surprising. At the security checkpoint, Jerome handed over both their boarding passes, and the TSA agent looked at them with the routine disinterest of someone who processed thousands of travelers every day, checking their IDs and waving them through without comment. It wasn't until they reached their gate that the difference in their seating arrangements became apparent, and Jerome knelt down beside his daughter's chair to have a conversation they'd discussed many times, but never actually needed to have until today. "You remember what we talked about?" he said quietly, his hands on her shoulders and his eyes serious in the way they got when he was trying to compress important parental wisdom into a moment that wouldn't last long enough for everything he wanted to say. "You're flying first class because this meeting requires you to arrive rested and prepared, and because the executives you're meeting with will expect a certain level of presentation from someone in your position, even if they don't know exactly who you are yet." Zara nodded, understanding the complexity behind the decision without needing him to explain it further. Her first-class ticket had been purchased by the law firm representing her interests in today's negotiation, a gesture of professional courtesy that also served the practical purpose of giving her space to review her materials and prepare mentally for what was coming. Jerome's coach ticket had been his own choice, a reminder to himself and to anyone who might be watching that, despite their recent financial success, the Williams family hadn't forgotten where they came from or what kind of people they intended to remain. "I'll be fine, Daddy," Zara said, reaching up to straighten his tie with the kind of natural caretaking instinct that children develop when they've lost one parent and want to make sure the remaining one feels loved and supported. "It's just a few hours and then we'll be together again when you pick me up tonight." That was when Maya Rodriguez appeared beside their gate seats, a 9-year-old girl with dark curls and bright eyes who had been sitting across the waiting area with her own small suitcase, obviously traveling alone and looking nervous about it. She approached Zara and Jerome with the particular directness that children use when they're curious about something and haven't yet learned to hide their interest behind adult politeness. "Are you flying by yourself, too?" Maya asked Zara, ignoring Jerome entirely in the way that children do when they're focused on connecting with another child, and adults are just background noise. "I'm going to see my grandparents in San Francisco, but my mom couldn't come with me because she had to work, and I've never flown alone before, and I'm kind of scared." Zara smiled, the first genuinely relaxed smile she'd worn all morning, because talking to other children was always easier than preparing for meetings with adults who would judge her based on expectations and assumptions she couldn't control. "I'm not exactly flying alone," she said, gesturing toward Jerome, "but my dad's sitting in a different part of the plane, so I guess I'll be by myself too." "What's your name?" "Maya Rodriguez," the girl said, settling into the empty seat beside Zara without waiting for an invitation, the way children do when they've decided someone is safe and interesting. "I'm 9 years old, and I live in Detroit with my mom and my little brother, and my grandparents live in San Francisco, and they're going to take me to see the sea lions at Pier 39, and I've never seen a real sea lion before." "I'm Zara Williams, and I'm 11, and I think sea lions are amazing," Zara replied. And something about this simple exchange of basic information between two children who had just met felt like the most normal and comfortable part of her entire day. A reminder that underneath all the business meetings and legal documents and financial strategies, she was still just a kid who enjoyed talking to other kids about exciting things like sea lions and family visits. Jerome watched this interaction with the mixture of pride and sadness that had become familiar since Destiny's death, proud of his daughter's natural kindness and social ease, but sad that she so rarely had opportunities to just be a regular child, having regular conversations with other regular children. Her intelligence and business responsibilities set her apart from most kids her age, and her grief over losing Destiny made her more serious than most 11-year-olds. But watching her chat with Maya about travel and family and sea lions, he could see glimpses of the carefree little girl she might have been in different circumstances. When boarding began, Jerome hugged Zara goodbye at the gate, reminding her to call him as soon as she landed, and to remember that no matter what happened in her meeting, he was proud of her for carrying on Destiny's work and for handling responsibilities that would challenge most adults. Maya hugged her too, this new friend who had made the scary prospect of flying alone feel much less intimidating, and promised to look for Zara on the plane once they were in the air. Zara boarded early with the first-class passengers, walking down the jet bridge with the confident stride that Destiny had taught her head up and shoulders back, carrying herself like someone who belonged wherever she was going because she had every right to be there. She found her seat 4A, a window seat toward the front of the first-class cabin, and settled in with her notebook and the carefully wrapped photograph of her mother, placing it gently on the tray table beside her laptop while she prepared for the work she wanted to accomplish during the flight. She didn't notice the platinum-blonde flight attendant watching her from the galley, didn't see the slight frown that crossed the woman's face when she observed this obviously young passenger in first class, and had no way of knowing that Brittany Summers had already decided that something about this situation didn't look quite right to her professional eye, though she couldn't yet articulate exactly what was bothering her about the little black girl in seat 4A. First class on the morning flight from Detroit to San Francisco was only half full, which meant there was plenty of space for everyone to spread out and enjoy the additional comfort that came with paying premium prices for air travel. Though in Zara's case, the ticket had been purchased by her legal team as a business expense related to the day's important negotiations. She arranged her materials carefully on the tray table in front of her, opening her laptop to review the presentation slides she'd been perfecting for weeks while keeping Destiny's photograph positioned where she could see her mother's encouraging smile whenever she needed a reminder of why this trip mattered so much. The other first-class passengers settled into their own routines with the practiced efficiency of frequent travelers who knew how to maximize their comfort during long flights. In seat 5, B, directly across the aisle from Zara Harrison Walsh, opened his Wall Street Journal and immediately began reading the financial section with the intense focus of a man whose wealth depended on staying informed about market movements and corporate developments. He was in his early 60s, silver-haired and expensively dressed, the kind of businessman who flew first class so regularly that he barely noticed his surroundings anymore, though something about the young girl working on a laptop across from him did catch his peripheral attention. 3 rows behind Zara, in seat 6. Diana Foster was settling in for what she hoped would be a productive flight, spreading legal briefs across her seat and the empty space beside her while reviewing case files for the civil rights lawsuit she was scheduled to argue in federal court next week. As one of the most respected civil rights attorneys on the West Coast, Diana had spent her career fighting discrimination in all its forms, but she approached her work with the quiet determination of someone who preferred to win cases through careful preparation rather than dramatic courtroom theatrics. Dr. Samuel Torres took seat 7C near the back of the first-class cabin, immediately pulling out a medical journal and beginning to read about new developments in pediatric trauma treatment, his area of specialization at Children's Hospital of Michigan. He was a soft-spoken man in his 40s, who had dedicated his career to helping children heal from physical and emotional wounds, and something about seeing a young passenger traveling alone in first class triggered his professional instincts to pay attention to her well-being, though he tried not to stare or make her uncomfortable with his concern. Maya appeared in the first-class cabin about 20 minutes after takeoff, having convinced her flight attendant that she needed to use the bathroom at the front of the plane, though her real purpose was to check on her new friend Zara and see how she was settling in, for someone who still lost teeth and for someone who still lost teeth and collected stickers. "What are you working on?" Maya asked, sliding into the empty seat beside Zara without invitation, her natural curiosity overriding any concern about whether she was supposed to be in first class or not. "It looks really important and grown up." Zara looked up from her presentation slides, grateful for the interruption because she'd been feeling increasingly nervous about the day ahead, and Maya's presence was a welcome reminder that some things in life were still simple and straightforward. "I'm preparing for a business meeting," she explained, minimizing the window on her screen so Maya could see the photograph of Destiny instead. "This is my mom. She died last year, but she started something really important, and today I'm going to finish it for her." Maya studied the photograph with the serious attention that children give to important information, taking in Destiny's warm smile and the obvious love between mother and daughter captured in the image. "She looks like she was really nice," Maya said finally. "And really pretty. I bet she was proud of you for doing important business stuff." "She was," Zara said, touching the edge of the frame gently. "She always told me that being young doesn't mean your ideas aren't valuable, and that if you want to change the world, you have to start by believing you're capable of changing it. Today I'm going to prove she was right about that." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Brittany Summers, the senior flight attendant who had been observing this interaction from the galley and had decided it was time to investigate what appeared to be a breach of cabin protocol. Brittany was 29 years old with platinum blonde hair pulled back in a regulation style and the kind of practiced professional smile that never quite reached her eyes, especially when she was dealing with situations that didn't fit her expectations of how things were supposed to work. "Excuse me, honey," Brittany said to Maya, her tone carrying just enough sweetness to sound polite while making it clear that this was not actually a request. "You need to return to your assigned seat in the economy section. First-class passengers are not allowed to have visitors during flight, and you're creating a safety concern by being in the aisle." Maya looked confused, glancing between Brittany and Zara, as if trying to understand why talking to her friend could possibly be considered dangerous to anyone. "But I'm not in the aisle," she said reasonably. "I'm sitting in a seat and there's nobody else sitting here, so I'm not bothering anyone." Brittany's smile became more strained, and she turned her attention to Zara with the particular expression that adults use when they're about to explain rules that children are expected to follow without question. "And I'm going to need to see your boarding pass, sweetie." There seems to be some confusion about seating arrangements, and I want to make sure everyone is where they're supposed to be." Zara felt something cold settle in her stomach, recognizing the tone and the implications behind Brittany's request, though she responded with the calm dignity that destiny had taught her to maintain in situations where adults questioned her right to be somewhere. "My boarding pass is in my bag," she said evenly. "But this is definitely my assigned seat. I checked it 3 times before boarding." "I'm sure you did, honey. But sometimes there are computer errors, and children traveling alone don't always understand how airline seating works," Brittany replied, her condescension becoming more obvious with each word. "If you could just show me your boarding pass, we can get this sorted out quickly and make sure everyone is comfortable." Maya looked back and forth between the two of them, her 9-year-old mind processing the obvious unfairness of the situation with the clarity that children often bring to adult conflicts. "Why do you need to see her boarding pass but not anyone else's?" she asked with the directness that makes adults uncomfortable when they're doing something they know is wrong. "You didn't ask that man for his boarding pass, or that lady, or that doctor man. Why just her?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and everyone in the first-class cabin who had been pretending not to listen suddenly found themselves paying very close attention to what was happening in row 4. Though none of them was quite ready to acknowledge what they were witnessing or do anything about it. The silence that followed Maya's innocent question was the kind of uncomfortable quiet that fills a space when everyone present knows something wrong is happening, but nobody wants to be the person who names it out loud and forces everyone else to choose sides. Harrison Walsh looked up from his newspaper for the first time since boarding his businessman's instincts, recognizing a situation that was escalating beyond normal customer service protocols. Diana Foster closed her legal brief and turned slightly in her seat, her civil rights attorney training alerting her to the possibility of witnessing actionable discrimination in real time. Dr. Torres marked his place in his medical journal and focused his attention on the interaction concerned about the potential psychological impact on the children involved. Brittany's professional smile faltered for just a moment when she realized that multiple passengers were now watching her handle what should have been a simple seating verification. But she recovered quickly and doubled down on her authority with the confidence of someone who had never faced serious consequences for overstepping professional boundaries. "Airline policies apply to all passengers equally," she said, though her tone suggested she wasn't particularly interested in explaining herself to a 9-year-old child. "Sometimes special accommodations need to be made for unaccompanied minors, and it's my responsibility to ensure everyone's safety and comfort during the flight." Maya opened her mouth to ask another question, but Zara gently touched her arm and shook her head, recognizing that this situation was bigger than anything a child should have to navigate, and wanting to protect her new friend from becoming a target of Brittany's obviously increasing hostility. "It's okay," Zara said quietly to Maya. "You should probably go back to your seat now. I'll be fine." But before Maya could respond, Brittany's attention shifted to the items arranged on Zara's tray table, and something in her expression changed when she noticed the framed photograph of Destiny positioned next to Zara's laptop and scattered papers. "I'm going to need you to put that personal item away," she announced, pointing at the photograph with the kind of authority that suggested she was citing actual safety regulations rather than making arbitrary demands. "Personal photographs are not permitted to remain unsecured during flight, and that frame could become a projectile in the event of turbulence." Zara felt her breath catch in her throat because Destiny's photograph was the most precious thing she owned. The tangible connection to her mother that she carried everywhere, and that provided comfort and strength when she faced challenges that seemed too big for an 11-year-old to handle alone. "It's not hurting anyone," she said, her voice remaining steady despite the fear that was beginning to build in her chest. "I'll hold on to it if you're worried about turbulence." "That's not acceptable," Brittany replied, stepping closer to Zara's seat with the kind of aggressive body language that was designed to intimidate and establish dominance. Airline safety regulations are not negotiable, and I have the authority to enforce them as I see fit. You can either put that item away voluntarily, or I can remove it for you, but it cannot remain on your tray table during flight." Dr. Torres shifted forward in his seat, his medical training recognizing signs of escalating stress in both children, while Diana Foster reached for the pen she used to take notes during depositions, instinctively preparing to document whatever was about to happen. Harrison Walsh folded his newspaper completely and turned to face the confrontation directly, his business experience telling him that this situation was spiraling beyond normal customer service boundaries. Maya looked up at Brittany with the kind of confusion that children experience when adults behave in ways that contradict everything they've been taught about kindness and fairness. "But it's just a picture of her mom," she said, her voice small but determined. "My mom always says pictures of people we love keep us safe and happy. Why would you want to take that away from someone?" The question hit its target perfectly, exposing the cruelty underlying Brittany's demands and forcing everyone in the cabin to confront what they were really witnessing. This wasn't about safety regulations or airline policies. This was about power and prejudice, and an adult woman using her authority to humiliate a child who couldn't fight back effectively. Zara looked down at her mother's photograph, seeing Destiny's encouraging smile and remembering all the conversations they'd had about dealing with people who would try to make her feel small or unworthy because of her age or her race or her gender. Destiny had taught her to respond to such treatment with dignity rather than anger, to document everything and seek justice through proper channels rather than engaging in confrontations that she couldn't win. "I'll put it away," Zara said quietly, reaching for the photograph with hands that trembled slightly despite her efforts to remain composed. "I don't want to cause any problems for anyone." But Brittany's patience had apparently run out, because instead of waiting for Zara to handle her own belongings, she reached across the seats and grasped the frame herself, clearly intending to remove it immediately rather than allowing Zara to comply with her demands at her own pace. "I'll take care of it," she announced, her fingers closing around the silver frame that contained the most important image in Zara's life. "No," Zara said sharply, her careful composure finally cracking as she reached out to protect the one thing that connected her to her mother's memory. "Please don't touch that. I can put it away myself." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion, the way traumatic events often do when the brain struggles to process actions that are too painful to accept as real. Brittany's grip on the frame was careless and aggressive, more concerned with establishing her authority than with handling someone else's precious possessions with appropriate care. Whether she intended for the frame to slip from her fingers, or whether it was a genuine accident, would become a matter of dispute later, but the result was the same. The silver frame fell from Brittany's grasp and hit the aircraft floor with a sharp crack that seemed impossibly loud in the confined space of the first-class cabin. The glass shattered on impact, sending fragments across the aisle and under nearby seats, while Destiny's photograph fluttered free from its protective frame and landed face up on the carpet, surrounded by the scattered pieces of something that could never be properly repaired. Maya gasped audibly, her hands flying to her mouth in horror at witnessing the destruction of something so obviously important to her friend. Harrison Walsh stood up abruptly, his businessman's sense of appropriate behavior finally overriding his preference for avoiding confrontation. Diana Foster was already writing notes documenting the time and circumstances of what she was witnessing. Dr. Torres moved toward the children, his medical instincts responding to the obvious trauma being inflicted. Zara stared at the broken glass and the photograph of her mother lying exposed on the airplane floor, and for one terrible moment, everyone in the first-class cabin could see the raw grief and shock on her face before she managed to lock her emotions down and respond with the dignity that destiny had taught her to maintain even in the worst circumstances. She looked up at Brittany with eyes that were bright with unshed tears, but steady with a kind of quiet strength that was remarkable in someone so young. "You have no idea what you just did," she said in a voice that was barely above a whisper, but somehow carried more authority than Brittany's shouting had managed to convey. Brittany looked down at the broken frame and scattered glass, and instead of apologizing or showing any recognition of the pain she had just caused, she shrugged with the casual indifference of someone who had never learned to take responsibility for the consequences of her actions. "I'll have someone clean that up," she said dismissively, already turning to walk away as if destroying a child's most precious possession was just part of her normal job duties. And that was the moment when everyone in the first-class cabin realized they had just witnessed something unforgivable, though none of them yet understood that the quiet little girl in seat 4A was about to make sure that consequences for such behavior would never again be swept under the rug or buried in airline bureaucracy. The silence that followed Brittany's departure was heavy with the weight of witnessed injustice, the kind of terrible quiet that settles over a group of people who have just watched something deeply wrong happen and are struggling with their own complicity in allowing it to continue unchallenged. Zara knelt carefully beside her seat and began collecting the pieces of broken glass with her bare hands, moving slowly and methodically, despite the way her fingers shook with the effort of maintaining her composure, while her heart broke over the destruction of something irreplaceable. Maya immediately knelt beside her, helping to gather the scattered fragments without being asked. Her 9-year-old mind understanding that this was what you did when someone you cared about was hurt. You helped them pick up the pieces even when you couldn't fix what was broken. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice thick with tears that were flowing freely down her cheeks, because children haven't yet learned to hide their emotions when witnessing cruelty. "I'm so sorry that mean lady broke your mom's picture." Dr. Torres appeared beside them with a handful of tissues and a small first aid kit from his carry-on bag, kneeling down to check. "Let me see your hands, sweetheart," he said. "Let me see your hands, sweetheart," he said softly. "We need to make sure you didn't hurt yourself trying to clean this up." Diana Foster was out of her seat as well, using her phone to take photographs of the broken frame and scattered glass, her legal training automatically kicking in to document evidence of what could potentially become a civil rights case if the pattern of behavior she was witnessing continued to escalate. She crouched down near the children and spoke quietly to Zara while continuing to capture images that might be needed later. "I'm a lawyer, honey, and I want you to know that what just happened was not okay. And it was not your fault, and there are laws that protect people from being treated this way." Harrison Walsh remained standing in the aisle, his businessman's instincts warring with his basic human decency as he watched an 11-year-old girl handle an impossible situation with more grace than most adults could manage. He had spent his entire career avoiding exactly this kind of messy human drama, preferring to focus on numbers and profits and market strategies that didn't require him to take moral stands or get emotionally involved in other people's problems. But something about seeing Zara's careful dignity in the face of such deliberate cruelty was making it impossible for him to retreat back into comfortable indifference. Zara gently freed her hands from Dr. Torres's examination and wrapped Destiny's photograph in the silk scarf she always carried, the one with the golden butterflies that had been her mother's favorite, creating a protective layer around the image that could never be broken, no matter what happened to frames or glass or any other material objects. "Thank you all for caring," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tears that were finally beginning to flow down her cheeks. "But I need to handle this myself. My mama taught me how to deal with people who try to make me small, and I'm going to make her proud by doing exactly what she would have done." She settled back into her seat and pulled out her leather notebook, opening it to a fresh page and beginning to write with the focused intensity of someone who had just shifted from victim to strategist, from recipient of injustice to architect of accountability. What she wrote was not a complaint letter or an angry rant or even a detailed account of what had happened, though all of those things might come later. Instead, she began composing something that looked remarkably like a business plan, complete with timelines and objectives and measurable outcomes. because destiny had raised her to understand that emotions were important, but results were what mattered when you wanted to create lasting change. Maya climbed into the empty seat beside Zara and watched her write, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated the kind of moral clarity that children possess before adults teach them to compromise their ethics for the sake of social convenience. "Why didn't any of the grown-ups stop her from being mean to you?" she asked, genuinely confused by the adults' failure to intervene when the situation was so obviously wrong. "Don't they know that hurting people's feelings is not allowed?" This question hung in the air like an indictment, forcing every adult within earshot to confront their own inaction and examine the reasons why they had chosen to remain silent when their voices might have made a difference. Dr. Torres returned to his seat, but continued watching Zara with professional concern, recognizing signs of resilience that were remarkable in someone so young, but worried about the long-term psychological impact of experiencing such blatant discrimination. Diana Foster resumed her documentation process, using her legal experience to build a comprehensive record of events that could support future action against the airline and the individual employee responsible. Harrison Walsh finally sat back down, but found himself unable to focus on his newspaper, instead watching Zara work in her notebook and thinking about his own daughter, who was currently attending an elite private school, where such treatment would be unthinkable, not because the people there were necessarily better human beings, but because wealth and privilege created protective barriers that insulated his family from the kind of casual cruelty that had just been inflicted on this remarkable child. The realization that his comfortable life existed partly because other people's children were forced to navigate such hostility made him deeply uncomfortable in ways he wasn't quite ready to examine. Meanwhile, in the galley at the rear of the first-class section, Brittany was having a conversation with Riley Johnson, the junior flight attendant who had been working this route for only 8 months and was still learning to navigate the complex dynamics between senior crew members' airline policies and passenger relations. Riley was 24 years old, mixed race with natural hair that she kept carefully styled according to airline grooming standards, and she had been watching the confrontation in row 4 with growing discomfort and confusion about how she should respond. That little girl was clearly out of line. Brittany was explaining to Riley, her voice carrying the tone of someone who was used to having her version of events accepted without question by junior colleagues who couldn't afford to challenge senior staff members. Children traveling alone need to understand boundaries, and sometimes that means being firm about airline policies even when they don't like it. She was creating a safety hazard with that unsecured item, and when I tried to address it professionally, she became resistant and difficult. Riley listened to this explanation while thinking about what she had actually observed from her position in the galley, which was a flight attendant aggressively confronting a child over a harmless personal photograph, escalating a minor situation into a traumatic incident through what appeared to be racially motivated hostility. "I don't think she was being difficult," Riley said, carefully testing the waters to see how much dissent Brittany would tolerate from subordinate crew members. She seemed like she was trying to cooperate, and that photograph wasn't bothering anyone or creating any real safety issues. Brittany's expression hardened slightly, and Riley recognized the look of someone who was used to having her authority go unquestioned and didn't appreciate having her judgment critiqued by someone with less seniority. "You're still new to this job," Brittany replied with the patronizing tone that senior employees use when they want to remind junior staff of their place in the hierarchy. "When you've been doing this as long as I have, you'll understand that maintaining cabin discipline requires making tough decisions that passengers don't always appreciate. Sometimes you have to be the bad guy to keep everyone safe." But even as Brittany spoke these words, she was beginning to feel the first stirrings of uncertainty about how the situation in row 4 would be perceived by passengers, supervisors, and airline management if it became the subject of formal complaints or negative publicity. She had been protected by union representation and management indifference for so long that she had stopped worrying about consequences for her behavior, but something about the way multiple passengers had reacted to the incident was making her wonder if this particular confrontation might have crossed lines that even her usual protections couldn't excuse. Riley excused herself from the galley conversation and walked slowly through the first-class cabin, ostensibly checking on passenger needs, but actually observing the aftermath of what had just occurred. She saw Zara writing intensely in her notebook while Maya sat beside her, asking questions that demonstrated remarkable insight for someone so young. She saw Dr. Torres watching the children with obvious concern, and Diana Foster taking notes with the focused attention of someone building a legal case. She saw Harrison Walsh sitting with his newspaper folded and forgotten, staring at the back of Zara's seat with an expression that suggested he was reconsidering some fundamental assumptions about his responsibilities as a human being. When Riley reached Zara's row, she paused and spoke quietly, keeping her voice low enough that Brittany couldn't overhear from the galley. "I'm really sorry about what happened with your photograph," she said, her words carrying genuine regret and recognition of the injustice that had just occurred. "That should never have happened, and I want you to know that not everyone on this crew thinks what you experienced was appropriate or acceptable." Zara looked up from her notebook and studied Riley's face with the kind of careful attention that children use when they're trying to determine whether an adult can be trusted. What she saw there was sincerity and moral conflict. Someone who was struggling with her own role in a situation that violated her sense of right and wrong, but who lacked the authority or job security to take direct action against a senior colleague's misconduct. "Thank you for saying," that Zara replied simply, her voice carrying a maturity that was startling in someone so young. "It means something to me that you see what really happened and that you care enough to acknowledge it was wrong." Riley nodded and continued her walk through the cabin, but Zara's quiet dignity and obvious intelligence had made a lasting impression, planting seeds of moral courage that would grow throughout the remainder of the flight and eventually blossom into action that would help ensure justice was served and patterns of abuse were finally broken. 30 minutes had passed since the incident with Destiny's photograph, and the first-class cabin had settled into an uneasy quiet that felt nothing like the comfortable atmosphere that premium passengers expected when they paid extra for enhanced service and peaceful travel experiences. Zara continued writing in her leather notebook, occasionally pausing to look out the window at the landscape passing below while she organized her thoughts and refined the strategy that was taking shape on the pages before her. Though anyone watching might have assumed she was simply doing homework or writing letters to friends, rather than developing a comprehensive plan for corporate accountability and individual justice. Maya had returned to her assigned seat in the economy section at the gentle insistence of Dr. Torres, who had walked her back personally to ensure she wasn't confronted or intimidated by crew members who might be feeling defensive about the earlier confrontation. But she had promised to check on Zara again later in the flight, and had given her new friend a small paper airplane folded from magazine pages with "You're the bravest person I know," written in purple crayon across the wings. The gesture had touched Zara deeply, reminding her that kindness and recognition could come from unexpected sources, and that even children could serve as witnesses to injustice and allies in the pursuit of fairness. Harrison Walsh had attempted to return his attention to the financial reports he'd planned to review during the flight, but found himself repeatedly glancing toward row 4 and thinking about conversations he'd had with his own daughter about privilege and responsibility. Conversations that had always felt theoretical and abstract, until he witnessed firsthand what happened when children without protective advantages encountered adults who were willing to abuse their authority. He had built his wealth through real estate investments and corporate acquisitions, industries where success often required ignoring the human cost of business decisions. But watching Zara handle deliberate cruelty with such remarkable composure was forcing him to examine whether his comfortable indifference to other people's struggles was morally defensible. Diana Foster had filled several pages with detailed notes about the incident, including specific quotes, timestamps, and descriptions of Brittany's behavior that would be valuable if legal action became necessary. But her civil rights training had also taught her to look for patterns rather than isolated incidents, to understand individual acts of discrimination as symptoms of larger problems that required comprehensive solutions rather than Band-Aid responses. She had begun thinking about the airline's training procedures, hiring practices, and complaint resolution processes, recognizing that what had happened to Zara was likely part of a much broader pattern of bias that other passengers had probably experienced without having the resources or knowledge to seek appropriate remedies. Dr. Torres had returned to his medical journal, but his pediatric expertise made it impossible for him to ignore signs that the children involved in the earlier incident were continuing to process trauma that could have lasting psychological effects if not properly addressed. He had treated enough young patients who had been subjected to discrimination and abuse to recognize the careful control that Zara was maintaining over her emotional responses, a level of self-regulation that was admirable but also concerning in someone who should have been free to express her feelings without worrying about adult judgments or consequences. The relative calm was interrupted when Brittany returned to the first-class cabin accompanied by Captain James Lucky Patterson, a man whose presence immediately commanded respect despite his casual demeanor and obvious preference for resolving conflicts through conversation rather than confrontation. Lucky had been flying commercial aircraft for 23 years, and his reputation for fairness and professionalism was well known throughout the airline industry. Though what most people didn't know was that he had spent 18 months early in his career flying cargo routes for a small logistics company called Williams Transport Solutions, where he had experienced the kind of treatment from management that had restored his faith in human decency and professional ethics. Lucky approached Zara's seat with the respectful manner he used when addressing passengers who were dealing with difficult situations, though something about this particular child struck him as familiar in ways he couldn't immediately identify. "Good morning," he said, settling into the empty seat beside her with the easy confidence of someone who was comfortable talking to people of all ages and backgrounds. "I'm Captain Patterson, and I understand there was some kind of incident earlier that I should know about. Would you mind telling me what happened in your own words?" Zara looked up from her notebook and studied the captain's face with the same careful attention she had given to Riley earlier, searching for signs of genuine interest versus perfunctory obligation, looking for clues about whether this conversation would lead to meaningful action, or just another adult dismissing her concerns because of her age. What she saw in Lucky's expression was patience and sincerity, the kind of professional concern that suggested he was prepared to listen carefully and respond appropriately to whatever she told him. "The flight attendant destroyed my mother's photograph," Zara said simply, her voice carrying the factual precision of someone who had learned to present information clearly and concisely in business settings where emotional appeals were less effective than logical arguments. "She claimed it was a safety violation to keep it on my tray table, and when I tried to put it away myself, she grabbed it from my hands and dropped it on the floor, breaking the frame and scattering glass everywhere." Lucky nodded slowly, processing this information while observing Zara's demeanor and noting the remarkable composure she maintained while describing what was obviously a traumatic experience. "That sounds very upsetting," he said, his voice carrying the kind of genuine empathy that came from years of dealing with passenger concerns and understanding that what might seem minor to airline employees could be devastating to the people who experienced it. "Can you tell me a little more about why that photograph was so important to you?" "My mother died 18 months ago," Zara explained, her voice remaining steady despite the obvious pain that mentioning Destiny's death still caused her. "That picture was taken on my 10th birthday, and it's one of the last photographs we have together where she was still healthy and happy. I carry it with me when I travel because it helps me remember her advice when I'm facing difficult situations. And I was looking at it today because I have an important business meeting in San Francisco that would make her very proud." Something in Lucky's expression shifted when Zara mentioned her mother's death and the business meeting pieces of a puzzle clicking into place in ways that made his breath catch slightly as recognition began to dawn. "What kind of business meeting?" he asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer, and the implications were making his heart race with a combination of excitement and dread. "I'm finalizing the acquisition of SkyWest Airlines," Zara said matter-of-factly, as if 11-year-olds routinely purchased major corporations during cross-country flights. "The paperwork has been in progress for 6 months, and today's meeting will make it official. My mother started planning this purchase before she got sick, and finishing it is one of the promises I made to her before she died." Lucky stared at Zara for a long moment, his mind racing as he processed the full implications of what she had just told him, because SkyWest Airlines was the holding company that owned the airline they were currently flying on, which meant that this remarkable child who had just been subjected to discrimination and abuse by his flight crew was about to become, technically speaking, everyone's boss. The irony was staggering, but more than that, the opportunity for justice was unprecedented, assuming Zara was telling the truth about her business intentions and had the legal authority to follow through on such extraordinary claims. Your mother, Lucky, said slowly, pieces of his own history suddenly making sense in ways that felt almost impossible to believe. Was her name Destiny Williams, and did she own Williams Transport Solutions? Zara's eyes widened with surprise and recognition because very few people outside of industry circles would have known about her mother's logistics company or been able to make that connection based on the limited information she had provided. "You knew my mama?" she asked, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking slightly as emotions that she had been holding back began to surface. "I knew her." Lucky confirmed, his voice thick with memories of a woman who had treated him with respect and generosity during one of the most difficult periods of his career, when other employers had been quick to judge and slow to forgive the mistakes that had temporarily grounded him and left him scrambling for work to support his family. "She gave me a chance when nobody else would, and she treated me with more kindness and professionalism than I had any right to expect. Your mother was one of the finest people I ever had the privilege of working for." The conversation was interrupted by Brittany's return to row 4, though she was no longer alone and no longer projecting the confident authority that had characterized her earlier interactions with Zara. Standing beside her was Riley, who had made a decision during the past 30 minutes that would define the rest of her career and possibly change the course of multiple lives. Though she was still nervous about the consequences of speaking truth to power in an industry where junior employees were expected to support their supervisors regardless of personal ethical concerns. Captain Patterson Riley said, her voice steady, despite the obvious anxiety she felt about challenging a senior colleague in front of management. "I need to file a formal complaint about the incident that occurred earlier in this cabin. What I witnessed was not appropriate professional conduct, and I believe it violated both company policies and federal regulations regarding passenger treatment and anti-discrimination protections." Brittany's face went pale as she realized that her careful narrative about safety concerns and passenger compliance was about to be contradicted by someone who had observed the entire incident and was prepared to provide testimony that could not be dismissed or discredited through union protection or management favoritism. "Riley, you don't understand the full context," she said, her voice carrying a note of desperation that had not been present in any of her earlier interactions. "Sometimes difficult passengers require firm handling, and junior crew members don't always see the bigger picture when it comes to cabin management and safety protocols." But Riley had found her courage now, and having crossed the line from silent witness to active ally, she was prepared to provide the kind of detailed professional testimony that could not be ignored or buried in bureaucratic procedures. "I understand exactly what I witnessed," she replied firmly. "And what I saw was a flight attendant deliberately destroying a child's personal property, making unfounded accusations about safety violations, and treating a passenger differently based on her apparent race and age. That's not cabin management. That's discrimination, and it's unacceptable." The confrontation in row 4 had attracted the attention of every passenger in the first-class cabin, and several people from the economy section had begun craning their necks and standing in the aisle to observe what was clearly becoming a significant incident that went far beyond normal airline customer service disputes. The atmosphere on the aircraft had shifted from routine travel to something much more charged and consequential, as if everyone present understood they were witnessing events that would have lasting repercussions extending far beyond this single flight. Captain Patterson found himself in the unusual position of managing a crew conflict while simultaneously processing information that fundamentally changed his understanding of the passenger at the center of the dispute. His decades of experience had taught him to handle difficult situations with calm professionalism, but nothing in his training had prepared him to deal with a scenario where a child who had been mistreated by his staff was also potentially the future owner of the airline, creating both moral and practical obligations that required immediate and decisive action. "Brittany," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that experienced pilots use when situations require absolute clarity and compliance. "I'm going to need you to step away from this passenger and return to the galley while we sort this out. Riley, I want you to prepare a written report documenting everything you witnessed with specific times and direct quotes wherever possible. This matter is going to be reviewed at the highest levels of company management." Brittany's confident facade finally began to crumble as she realized that her usual protections might not be sufficient to shield her from the consequences of what had transpired, especially with multiple witnesses providing corroborating testimony and a captain who seemed determined to pursue formal accountability rather than allowing the incident to be quietly buried through union intervention. "Captain, I followed standard safety protocols," she said, though her voice lacked the conviction she had displayed earlier when she was certain that her version of events would be accepted without question. "If this passenger feels mistreated, that was certainly not my intention, and I'm sure we can resolve any misunderstandings through normal customer service channels." "This isn't about misunderstandings or customer service," Lucky replied, his tone making it clear that he was not interested in face-saving measures or bureaucratic solutions that would sweep the incident under the rug. "This is about a pattern of behavior that multiple passengers and crew members have now documented, and it's going to be investigated thoroughly and transparently." Diana Foster approached the group with her phone in hand, having spent the past several minutes recording audio of the confrontation and preparing to offer her professional services as a civil rights attorney if Zara's family decided to pursue legal action against the airline. "Excuse me, Captain," she said, introducing herself with the credentialed authority of someone whose expertise was directly relevant to the situation at hand. "I'm Diana Foster, and I'm a civil rights attorney specializing in discrimination cases. I've been documenting this incident since it began, and I believe there are serious federal violations that need to be addressed." Dr. Torres joined the growing circle of adults surrounding Zara's seat, bringing his medical bag and his professional concerns about the psychological impact of the ongoing confrontation on the children involved. "I'm also worried about the emotional trauma being inflicted here," he added, his voice carrying the clinical objectivity of someone trained to assess and treat the effects of abuse on young patients. "What this child has experienced today could have lasting psychological consequences, and continuing to expose her to hostile behavior from airline staff is making the situation worse, not better." Maya had returned from the economy section despite instructions to stay in her assigned seat, drawn by her concern for Zara and her 9-year-old sense of justice that refused to accept adult explanations for behavior that was obviously wrong. She pushed through the cluster of adults and took Zara's hand, providing the kind of uncomplicated support that only children can offer to each other during difficult times. "Why are all these grown-ups arguing?" she asked Zara quietly. "Why can't they just say sorry for breaking your mom's picture and promise not to be mean anymore?" The question cut through all the adult complexity and legal terminology and professional posturing to reach the heart of what should have been a simple matter of acknowledging wrongdoing and making appropriate amends. But Maya's innocent expectation that adults would behave with basic decency only highlighted how far the situation had escalated beyond normal human courtesy and into territory that required formal intervention and consequences. Harrison Walsh finally stood up from his seat and approached the group, his businessman's instincts telling him that this situation was spiraling toward outcomes that would be damaging for everyone involved unless someone with experience in crisis management took steps to de-escalate tensions and focus on practical solutions rather than emotional confrontations. Perhaps we should consider moving this discussion to a more private setting, he suggested, his voice carrying the diplomatic tone he used in corporate negotiations where multiple parties had competing interests that needed to be balanced. This young lady has been through enough public humiliation for one day. But Zara herself had been listening to all of this adult conversation with growing impatience because while the various passengers and crew members debated procedures and consequences, the core issue of accountability and justice remained unaddressed. And her mother had taught her that when adults were more focused on protecting their own comfort than addressing wrongs that had been committed, sometimes children had to remind them of what really mattered. "I don't need anyone to move this conversation somewhere private," she said, standing up from her seat and addressing the group of adults with a composure and authority that was remarkable in someone so young. "What I need is for people to acknowledge what really happened here, and to take responsibility for making sure it doesn't happen to other children who might not have as many people willing to speak up for them." She looked directly at Brittany, who had been trying to fade into the background while the other adults discussed legal implications and professional consequences and spoke with the kind of moral clarity that cut through all attempts at rationalization or excuse-making. "You destroyed something that meant everything to me, not because you were following safety rules, but because you decided I didn't deserve to be treated with respect. You made that decision based on what I look like and how old I am, and you thought you could get away with it because children don't usually have the power to hold adults accountable for treating them badly." The first-class cabin had become completely silent except for the steady hum of the aircraft engines as every passenger and crew member present recognized that they were witnessing something extraordinary. A moment when someone who should have been powerless was refusing to accept that powerlessness and was demanding justice with a dignity and intelligence that shamed everyone who had initially chosen to remain silent. "I forgive you for what you did." Zara continued, her voice steady and clear. "Because my mama taught me that forgiveness is something you do for yourself, not for other people. But forgiveness doesn't mean there shouldn't be consequences, and it doesn't mean other children should have to go through what I went through today because adults were too comfortable or too scared to stand up and say that treating people this way is wrong." Maya squeezed Zara's hand and looked up at all the adults surrounding them, her 9-year-old wisdom cutting through the complexity of the situation with startling clarity. "She's right," Maya said simply. "My mom always tells me that when someone does something wrong, saying sorry is just the first step. The next step is making sure you don't do it again, and the step after that is helping other people not get hurt the same way." Captain Patterson nodded slowly, recognizing that these children were demonstrating more moral courage and practical wisdom than many adults manage to display in their entire careers, and understanding that his responsibility as both a leader and a human being was to ensure that their courage led to meaningful change rather than empty promises and continued patterns of abuse. "You're absolutely right," he said to both children, his voice carrying the weight of someone making a commitment that he intended to honor regardless of the personal or professional costs involved. "And I promise you that there will be consequences and there will be changes, and no other child will have to experience what happened to you today." As the aircraft continued its westward journey toward San Francisco, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin had transformed from routine travel to something approaching a mobile courtroom where testimony was being given, evidence was being collected, and judgments were being formed that would have consequences extending far beyond the duration of the flight itself. Captain Patterson had taken control of the situation with the kind of decisive leadership that his years of experience had taught him to employ during emergencies, though this particular crisis was unlike anything he had encountered in his decades of commercial aviation. Riley Johnson had retreated to the galley to prepare the formal complaint report that Lucky had requested, working with the methodical precision of someone who understood that her words might eventually be read in corporate boardrooms and federal courtrooms, scrutinized by lawyers and investigators who would be looking for any inconsistencies or ambiguities that could be used to discredit her testimony. She had never filed a complaint against a colleague before, especially not a senior crew member with union protection and management connections. But watching Zara handle such deliberate cruelty with remarkable dignity had crystallized her understanding that some situations required personal courage regardless of potential professional consequences. Brittany remained in the first-class cabin, her earlier confidence replaced by visible anxiety, as she began to comprehend that this incident would not be quietly resolved through the informal networks and administrative procedures that had protected her throughout her 8-year career with the airline. The union representative she normally contacted when passengers complained about her behavior was not available at 35,000 feet, and the management contacts who had previously been willing to reclassify her misconduct as misunderstandings or personality conflicts were not present to spin this situation in her favor. Diana Foster continued documenting the ongoing interactions, her legal training automatically cataloging evidence that could support potential litigation, while her human empathy responded to the obvious injustice that had been inflicted on a child who deserved protection rather than persecution. She had handled enough discrimination cases to recognize the patterns of behavior that typically preceded formal complaints. But something about Zara's response to the situation suggested that this particular incident might lead to consequences that went far beyond typical lawsuit settlements or employee disciplinary actions. Dr. Torres had positioned himself near the children, monitoring their emotional states with the clinical objectivity of someone trained to assess psychological trauma in young patients, while simultaneously feeling deep personal anger about the unnecessary pain that had been inflicted on Zara through adult negligence and prejudice. His pediatric training had taught him to recognize signs of resilience in children who had survived difficult experiences, and he was impressed by Zara's ability to maintain her composure and advocate for herself, though he remained concerned about the long-term effects of witnessing such blatant discrimination during what should have been routine travel. Harrison Walsh had returned to his seat, but found himself unable to concentrate on anything other than the moral complexity of the situation unfolding around him, because his comfortable businessman's worldview was being challenged by a child whose intelligence and dignity made it impossible to dismiss her suffering as someone else's problem, or to rationalize his own initial inaction as appropriate neutrality. He had built his career by avoiding exactly this kind of emotionally charged conflict, preferring to deal with numbers and contracts rather than human drama, but Zara's courage was forcing him to examine whether his prosperity came partly from his willingness to ignore injustices that didn't directly affect his own family. Maya had claimed the empty seat beside Zara, despite various adults' suggestions that she should return to her assigned location, operating with the kind of loyal determination that children display when they have identified someone who needs their support, and have decided that adult rules about seating arrangements are less important than friendship and solidarity. Her presence served as a moral anchor for Zara, a reminder that kindness and recognition existed alongside cruelty and indifference, and her occasional questions continued to cut through adult complexity with the clarity that comes from not yet having learned to accept injustice as normal. Captain Patterson had been quiet for several minutes, processing information that was reshaping his understanding not only of the current situation, but also of his own professional history and personal obligations. The name Destiny Williams had triggered memories that he had not revisited for years. Recollections of a woman who had treated him with extraordinary kindness during one of the most difficult periods of his career, when personal mistakes had temporarily grounded him and left him scrambling for any flying work that would allow him to support his family and rebuild his reputation. "Zara," he said finally, his voice carrying a mixture of recognition and amazement that suggested he was still processing the full implications of what he had discovered. "I need to tell you something about your mother that I think you'll want to hear, and I need to tell you something about this airline that might change how you think about what happened here today." Zara looked up from her notebook where she had been writing steadily throughout the various confrontations and conversations, creating what appeared to be a comprehensive record of events, along with notes about future actions and strategic considerations that demonstrated planning abilities far beyond what most adults would expect from an 11-year-old. "What about my mama?" she asked, her voice carrying the eager attention that children give to any new information about parents they have lost. "Your mother saved my career," Lucky said simply, settling back into the seat beside Zara with the relaxed posture of someone preparing to share a story that was important to both the teller and the listener. "This was about 15 years ago, when I was still building flight hours and working contract positions for small cargo companies. I had made some mistakes, some poor decisions about maintenance procedures that got me fired from a major airline and blacklisted from most commercial flying jobs. I was married with 2 small children, and I was desperate for any work that would keep me in the cockpit and allow me to support my family." Zara listened with the intense focus she always gave to stories about her mother, hungry for any details that could help her understand the full scope of Destiny's life and the impact she had made on people beyond their immediate family circle. "How did you meet her?" she asked unconsciously, echoing the cadence and phrasing that Destiny had used when encouraging people to share their stories during business meetings and social gatherings. "I answered an advertisement for contract pilots to fly cargo routes for Williams Transport Solutions." Lucky continued, his voice warming as the memories became more vivid and detailed. "Most companies wouldn't even interview me once they learned about my employment history. But your mother sat down with me for over an hour, asking about my flying experience, my family situation, my plans for rebuilding my career. She didn't focus on my mistakes. She focused on my qualifications and my commitment to doing better." The conversation was interrupted by an announcement from the aircraft's public address system, though it was not the routine update about altitude and arrival time that passengers typically expected during cross-country flights. Instead, it was a message from the captain's usual co-pilot, explaining that Captain Patterson had been called away to address an urgent passenger services matter and would return to the cockpit shortly, though the flight would continue normally and arrive in San Francisco on schedule. What the passengers didn't know was that Lucky had made a private communication to the airline's ground operations team in San Francisco, alerting them to prepare for an unusual situation upon arrival, and requesting the presence of senior management representatives who would be needed to address what appeared to be a serious incident involving crew misconduct and potential legal liability. He had also sent a coded message to the airline's legal department, though he had been careful not to provide details that might allow the company's lawyers to begin developing defense strategies before all the facts had been thoroughly documented and reviewed. "Your mother hired me that day," Lucky continued, "and for the next 18 months I flew cargo routes throughout the Midwest and Southeast, rebuilding my reputation and my confidence, while learning about professionalism and integrity from watching how she ran her business. She treated every employee with respect, regardless of their position or their past, and she created an environment where people felt valued and supported rather than expendable and replaceable." Zara smiled for the first time since Brittany had broken her mother's photograph, because hearing stories about Destiny's kindness and leadership always helped her feel connected to the woman who had shaped her understanding of how to treat other people with dignity and fairness. "She always said that business was really about relationships," Zara said, "and that if you take care of people, they'll take care of you and your customers and your company. She never believed in treating workers like they were just costs to be managed instead of human beings with families and dreams." "That's exactly right," Lucky agreed, and that philosophy is why Williams Transport Solutions had the best safety record and the highest employee satisfaction ratings of any logistics company in the region. Your mother proved that doing the right thing was also good business even when other companies were cutting corners and treating people badly to increase their profits. The revelation that Lucky had personal experience with Destiny's business practices and leadership philosophy was creating a connection between past and present that none of them had anticipated, but it was also setting the stage for something much larger than personal recognition or individual accountability, because the intersection of past relationships and present circumstances was about to reveal possibilities for justice and change that went far beyond what anyone in the first-class cabin could have imagined when the flight began. The revelation of Lucky's professional relationship with Destiny Williams had fundamentally altered the dynamics of the situation unfolding in the first-class cabin, transforming what had appeared to be a routine discrimination incident into something much more complex and potentially consequential. Lucky found himself balancing multiple responsibilities, his duties as captain of an aircraft carrying 147 passengers, his personal debt to the memory of a woman who had restored his faith in human decency during a difficult period of his career, and his growing understanding that the child sitting beside him possessed both the moral authority and the practical power to create lasting change in an industry that desperately needed reform. Zara Lucky said, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone about to share information that would change everything. I need to tell you something else about this airline. Something that connects to what your mother was planning before she got sick. The company we're flying on today, along with 6 other regional carriers, is owned by SkyWest Holdings, which is the same corporation that your mother was negotiating to acquire through Williams Transport Solutions before her illness made it impossible for her to complete the transaction. Zara's eyes widened as she processed this information, her quick mind immediately grasping the implications of what Lucky was revealing and understanding that today's incident had occurred on an aircraft that would soon be under her ownership and operational control. Mama never told me the acquisition was this specific airline, she said quietly. Pieces of her mother's business strategy becoming clearer as she realized the full scope of Destiny's vision for expanding their logistics empire into passenger transportation and freight services. Your mother was very careful about keeping the details confidential until the paperwork was finalized. Lucky explained, because airline acquisitions involve complex regulatory approval processes and competitive considerations that require absolute secrecy until the transaction is officially completed. She knew that premature disclosure could affect stock prices, employee morale, and customer confidence in ways that might damage the companies involved. Diana Foster leaned forward in her seat, her legal training recognizing the extraordinary nature of what was being revealed and the unprecedented opportunities for justice that had just emerged from what had initially appeared to be a straightforward discrimination case. Are you saying that this child is about to become the owner of the airline whose employee just subjected her to deliberate mistreatment? She asked, her voice carrying a mixture of amazement and professional excitement as she contemplated the legal implications of such a scenario. That's exactly what I'm saying, Lucky confirmed, and it means that what happened here today isn't just a customer service failure or an individual employee misconduct issue. It's a leadership test for someone who's about to inherit responsibility for the treatment of thousands of passengers and the professional conduct of hundreds of crew members. Dr. Torres had been listening to this conversation with growing understanding of why Zara had maintained such remarkable composure throughout the ordeal she had experienced, because her response to discrimination and abuse had not been that of a powerless victim, but rather that of someone who understood that she would soon have the authority to ensure that such treatment never happened again to any passenger on any flight operated by her company. That explains the notebook, he said, gesturing toward the leather journal where Zara had been writing throughout the incident. You weren't just documenting what happened to you. You were developing policies and procedures to prevent it from happening to other people. Zara nodded, opening her notebook to show pages filled with detailed observations, policy recommendations, and implementation strategies that demonstrated planning abilities and moral vision that would have been impressive in an adult business leader, let alone a sixth grader who had just experienced significant personal trauma. Mama always taught me that when you have power, you have responsibility, she explained, and that if you're lucky enough to be in a position where you can fix problems that hurt people, then fixing those problems becomes your most important job, even more important than making money or impressing other business people. Maya squeezed Zara's hand and looked around at all the adults who were suddenly paying much more attention to her friend than they had when she was just another passenger being mistreated by airline staff. "So you're going to be the boss of all these people?" she asked, with the directness that children use when they want to understand power relationships and adult hierarchies. "Does that mean you can make sure that mean lady doesn't break other kids' pictures?" "That's exactly what it means," Zara replied, her voice carrying quiet determination as she contemplated the scope of her upcoming responsibilities and the opportunities they would create for implementing the kind of systematic changes that would honor Destiny's memory while protecting future passengers from experiencing the discrimination and abuse she had witnessed firsthand. "And it means I can make sure that flight attendants who treat people badly face real consequences instead of having their behavior ignored or covered up by union representatives and management officials who care more about avoiding lawsuits than protecting passengers." Brittany had been standing near the galley throughout this conversation, initially dismissive of what she assumed was childhood fantasy or adult indulgence of an upset passenger's dramatic claims. But as the details of Zara's business relationship with the airline became clearer and more specific, she began to comprehend that her casual cruelty toward a child had been directed at someone who would soon have the authority to end her career permanently and possibly pursue legal action that could result in personal financial liability and professional blacklisting throughout the aviation industry. "That's impossible," Brittany said, her voice carrying a note of desperation as she struggled to deny information that was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence or misunderstanding. "Children don't own airlines. There are regulations and legal requirements and board oversight that prevent minors from controlling major corporations, especially in industries like aviation, where safety and regulatory compliance require adult supervision and professional experience." Riley emerged from the galley where she had been preparing her formal complaint report, carrying a tablet that contained her detailed account of the incident, along with timestamps, direct quotes, and observations about Brittany's pattern of behavior toward passengers who didn't fit her expectations of appropriate first-class demographics. "Actually," Riley said, addressing Brittany's protests with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent the past hour researching corporate law and airline ownership regulations. "There are several legal mechanisms that allow minors to control major business entities through trusts, holding companies, and court-appointed guardianship arrangements, especially when they inherit assets from deceased parents who have established proper succession planning." Harrison Walsh had been watching this entire exchange with the fascination of someone whose business experience was helping him understand the extraordinary nature of what was unfolding, because he had been involved in enough corporate acquisitions to recognize the complexity of the legal and financial arrangements that would be required to transfer ownership of a major airline to an 11-year-old, regardless of her intelligence and maturity. "The logistics alone would be staggering," he said, though his tone suggested admiration rather than skepticism as he contemplated the planning and execution that such a transaction would require. "Your mother must have been working with some of the best corporate attorneys and financial advisors in the country to structure something this ambitious." She was Zara confirmed, pulling a folder from her backpack that contained documents bearing the letterheads of prestigious law firms and investment banks, along with correspondence that demonstrated the careful legal framework Destiny had established to ensure her daughter would inherit not just financial assets, but also the institutional support necessary to exercise effective control over complex business operations. "Mama spent the last 2 years of her life making sure that everything would be ready for me to take over when I turned 11, which happened 3 months ago, right on schedule. The conversation was interrupted by another announcement from the cockpit, this time informing passengers that they were beginning their descent into San Francisco and should prepare for landing in approximately 30 minutes. Though what the routine announcement didn't convey was that ground operations at San Francisco International Airport were preparing for an arrival that would be anything but routine, with senior airline executives, legal representatives, and federal regulatory officials standing by to address what promised to be one of the most significant passenger services incidents in recent aviation history. Dr. Torres gathered his medical bag and approached Zara's seat one final time, wanting to check on her psychological state before the aircraft landed, and the situation inevitably became even more complex and demanding. "How are you feeling about all of this?" he asked, his professional training helping him recognize signs of stress or emotional overload that might require intervention, though. What he observed was a child who appeared calm and focused despite everything she had experienced. "I'm sad about my mama's picture getting broken," Zara said honestly. "And I'm angry that someone would treat me that way just because of how I look and how old I am. But I'm also excited about the chance to make sure this doesn't happen to other children, because that's what Mama would want me to do with the power she worked so hard to give me." Maya looked around the first-class cabin at all the adults who had witnessed the incident and were now preparing to support Zara's efforts to seek justice and create lasting change. "I think your mama would be really proud of how you handled everything," she said, with the simple wisdom that children often possess about complex emotional situations. "You didn't let that mean lady make you feel small, and you're going to help other kids not get hurt the same way." Diana Foster closed her notebook and addressed Zara directly, her legal expertise helping her understand the unprecedented nature of the case that was about to unfold when they landed in San Francisco. "I want you to know that what happened to you today was a clear violation of federal civil rights laws," she said. "And if you decide to pursue legal action either as an individual passenger or as the new owner of this airline, I would be honored to represent your interests and help you achieve the kind of justice that creates lasting change rather than just financial compensation." "Thank you," Zara replied. "But I think the most important thing is making sure this company treats all passengers with dignity and respect, regardless of their age or race or how much money they have. Mama always said that real success isn't about punishing people who do wrong things. It's about creating systems that make it easier for people to do right things." Captain Patterson returned to the first-class cabin as the aircraft continued its descent toward San Francisco, his face showing the strain of someone who had spent the past hour coordinating with ground operations, airline management, and federal authorities to ensure that the situation would be handled appropriately upon landing. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the passengers who had witnessed or participated in the incident, "I want you to know that what happened on this flight today will be thoroughly investigated and that appropriate action will be taken to ensure accountability and prevent similar incidents in the future." He looked directly at Zara as he continued speaking, his voice carrying the weight of personal commitment as well as professional responsibility. "I also want you to know that the courage and dignity you've shown today has reminded all of us why we got into this business in the first place, which is to serve people with respect and to make sure that flying remains safe and welcoming for passengers of all backgrounds and ages." As the aircraft descended through the afternoon sky toward San Francisco International Airport, everyone in the first-class cabin understood that they were approaching not just a destination, but a reckoning, a moment when years of accumulated injustice would finally face consequences, and when the promise of meaningful change would either be fulfilled or broken, depending on the courage and integrity of the people who had witnessed what happened and were now called to ensure that their testimony led to lasting transformation, rather than empty promises and continued patterns of discrimination. San Francisco International Airport appeared through the aircraft windows as a sprawling landscape of runways and terminals bathed in the golden afternoon light that made the Bay Area famous for its natural beauty. though the passengers in the first-class cabin were too focused on the confrontation that awaited them on the ground to pay much attention to the scenic approach to one of America's busiest aviation hubs. The routine procedures of landing preparation, seatbelt checks, and tray table storage felt surreal against the backdrop of everything that had transpired during the flight, as if normal airline operations were continuing, despite the fact that fundamental assumptions about passenger treatment and employee accountability were about to be challenged in ways that would reverberate throughout the industry. Captain Patterson had spent the final minutes of the flight in radio communication with ground operations, coordinating an arrival that would be unlike anything in his 23-year career as a commercial pilot, because instead of the usual gate agent and ground crew waiting to service the aircraft, there would be a reception committee that included senior airline executives, legal representatives, federal transportation officials, and media relations specialists who had been alerted to prepare for what promised to be a significant public relations challenge with potential legal and regulatory implications. Zara gathered her materials as the aircraft taxied toward the gate, carefully placing her mother's damaged photograph in her backpack, along with the notebook that now contained a comprehensive record of the day's events and a detailed plan for implementing changes that would prevent other passengers from experiencing the discrimination and abuse she had witnessed firsthand. Her composure remained remarkable despite everything she had endured, though the strain was visible in the careful way she moved and the focused concentration she applied to simple tasks that should have been automatic for someone her age. Maya helped Zara organize her belongings while keeping up a steady stream of encouraging conversation that demonstrated the kind of intuitive emotional support that children often provide for each other during difficult situations. "When we get off the plane, are there going to be lots of important grown-ups who want to talk to you?" She asked, her curiosity mixed with concern about whether her friend would be overwhelmed by the attention and responsibility that were clearly about to descend upon her. "Probably," Zara replied, "but Mama prepared me for situations like this. She always said that when you have something important to say, you should say it clearly and honestly, and let other people worry about whether they're ready to hear it or not." Dr. Torres approached their row as passengers began standing and reaching for overhead compartments, his medical bag in hand, and his professional concern evident as he observed the children's emotional states during what was clearly a stressful transition from private trauma to public accountability. "I want both of you to know that what you've done today, standing up for what's right and supporting each other through a difficult situation, is exactly the kind of courage that changes the world," he said, his voice carrying the warmth and authority that made him effective with young patients who were dealing with circumstances beyond their control. Diana Foster had spent the descent time reviewing her notes and preparing for what she anticipated would be intense negotiations with airline representatives who would be eager to minimize their liability exposure while addressing the obvious civil rights violations that had been documented by multiple witnesses. "Zara," she said, "I want to make sure you understand that you don't have to talk to anyone today if you don't feel ready, and you have the right to have legal representation present during any discussions about this incident or your business relationship with the airline." Harrison Walsh gathered his own belongings while reflecting on how dramatically his understanding of corporate responsibility and personal ethics had been challenged by watching an 11-year-old girl handle injustice with more dignity and strategic thinking than most adult business leaders managed during crisis situations. "If you need any support navigating the business aspects of what's coming," he offered, "I have experience with corporate acquisitions and media management that might be helpful, though. It's clear you have excellent advisors and remarkable instincts for handling complex situations." Riley approached the group carrying her tablet and the formal complaint report she had prepared her decision to document Brittany's misconduct, having evolved into a commitment to ensure that her testimony would lead to meaningful accountability rather than bureaucratic cover-ups. "I've never done anything like this before," she admitted to Zara. "But watching how you handled everything today made me realize that staying silent when you witness wrong behavior makes you part of the problem, and I'd rather risk my job than continue being part of a system that allows people to be treated the way you were treated." Brittany remained near the galley as passengers prepared to disembark. Her earlier confidence completely evaporated as she contemplated the reception that awaited her on the ground and the possible consequences of behavior that she had never expected to be scrutinized by senior management federal investigators and civil rights attorneys. The union protection and management favoritism that had shielded her throughout her career suddenly seemed inadequate against the kind of comprehensive accountability that was about to be applied to her conduct. As the aircraft reached the gate and the seatbelt sign was turned off, Captain Patterson made one final announcement that was unlike any he had delivered in his decades of commercial flying. Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin our normal deplaning process, I want to personally thank the passengers and crew members who demonstrated courage and integrity during today's flight by speaking up against behavior that violated our company's values and our obligations to treat all passengers with dignity and respect. Your willingness to stand up for what's right rather than remaining silent and comfortable is what makes meaningful change possible in any organization or community. The gate area outside the aircraft was indeed crowded with more people than would normally be present for a routine arrival, though the assembled group maintained a professional demeanor that suggested careful coordination rather than chaotic response to an unexpected crisis. Zara could see through the aircraft windows that several people in business suits were waiting near the jet bridge along with others whose official-looking credentials and serious expressions suggested they were federal employees or legal representatives with significant authority and responsibility. Jerome Williams was among the waiting group, having flown to San Francisco on an earlier flight to be present when his daughter's aircraft arrived, though he had no advance knowledge of the incident that had occurred during her journey and was expecting to meet her for what should have been a routine business meeting rather than a confrontation about discrimination and corporate accountability. His surprise at seeing the crowd of officials and media representatives would soon give way to pride and concern as he learned about Zara's courage and the challenges she had faced while traveling alone. As passengers began moving toward the exit, Zara found herself surrounded by the adults who had witnessed her ordeal and had chosen to become allies in her pursuit of justice, rather than remaining comfortable bystanders who could claim ignorance about what they had observed. Dr. Torres walked beside her, ready to provide medical support if the stress became overwhelming. Diana Foster carried her documentation and prepared to offer legal guidance during what promised to be complex negotiations. Harrison Walsh brought his business experience and connections. Riley held her complaint report and her testimony about Brittany's behavior. Maya simply held Zara's hand, providing the kind of uncomplicated friendship that was perhaps the most important support of all. "Are you ready for this, Captain?" Patterson asked Zara as they approached the aircraft door, his question acknowledging both the immediate challenges that awaited them in the gate area and the longer-term responsibilities that would come with implementing the changes she had envisioned during the flight. "Mama always said that you're never really ready for the most important moments in your life," Zara replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what lay ahead. "She said you just have to trust that if you've prepared as well as you can and you're fighting for something that matters, then you'll find the strength to do what needs to be done when the time comes to do it." As they stepped off the aircraft and into the gate area, Jerome immediately moved toward his daughter, his parental instincts, recognizing signs of stress and emotional strain despite her remarkable composure, while the assembled officials and representatives waited respectfully for family reunification before beginning what would undoubtedly be lengthy and complex discussions about accountability, compensation, and systematic change. The next few hours would determine whether the courage Zara had demonstrated during the flight would translate into lasting transformation of an industry that had allowed discrimination to persist for far too long, or whether institutional inertia and legal maneuvering would minimize the impact of her testimony and perpetuate patterns of abuse that had harmed countless passengers who lacked her resources and determination. The conference room at San Francisco International Airport that had been hastily arranged for the post-flight discussions was larger and more formal than the cramped aircraft cabin where the incident had occurred, but the tension in the air was even more palpable as representatives from multiple organizations gathered around a polished table to address what everyone present understood was a situation with implications extending far beyond a single passenger complaint or isolated employee misconduct issue. The afternoon sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows illuminated faces that reflected a complex mixture of legal concern, corporate anxiety, moral outrage, and cautious optimism about the possibility of achieving meaningful justice. Zara sat between her father Jerome and Diana Foster, her leather notebook open on the table in front of her, as she prepared to present not just her account of what had happened during the flight, but also her comprehensive vision for transforming airline policies and procedures to prevent other passengers from experiencing the discrimination and abuse she had witnessed firsthand. Despite her young age and the traumatic nature of what she had endured, she projected an aura of calm authority that impressed even the most senior executives present, who were accustomed to dealing with angry passengers and their attorneys, but had never encountered a situation where the victim of mistreatment was also about to become their employer and ultimate decision-maker. The airline's executive team was led by Margaret Chen, the Senior Vice President of Customer Relations, a woman whose 20-year career in aviation had prepared her for crisis management and damage control, but not for negotiations with an 11-year-old who possessed both moral authority and practical power to implement sweeping organizational changes. Beside her sat David Rodriguez, the company's chief legal officer, whose job was to minimize liability exposure while ensuring compliance with federal anti-discrimination laws, and Sarah Kim, the head of human resources, whose immediate concern was managing the disciplinary process for Brittany Summers while preventing the incident from becoming a broader indictment of the airline's hiring practices and training procedures. Federal Transportation Authority investigator Michael Washington had driven from his San Francisco office specifically to document potential violations of passenger protection regulations, his presence signaling that this incident would be subject to federal oversight and possible regulatory action that could result in substantial fines and mandated operational changes affecting the entire airline industry. His methodical note-taking and careful questioning demonstrated the thoroughness with which federal agencies approached discrimination cases involving commercial aviation, particularly when multiple witnesses could provide corroborating testimony about patterns of biased behavior. Captain Patterson had requested permission to remain present during the discussions, despite having completed his official duties when the aircraft arrived at the gate, because his personal connection to Destiny Williams and his professional relationship with the airline created both moral and practical obligations to ensure that the outcome honored the memory of someone who had demonstrated extraordinary integrity in her own business dealings. Riley Johnson sat beside him, her formal complaint report completed, and submitted her testimony available to support whatever disciplinary actions or policy changes might emerge from the investigation. Before we begin discussing specific incidents or potential remedies, Margaret Chen said, her voice carrying the diplomatic tone that senior executives use when attempting to control conversations that could have significant legal and financial implications. I want to acknowledge that SkyWest Airlines is committed to providing excellent customer service to all passengers, regardless of their background, and we take any allegations of discriminatory treatment extremely seriously. Zara looked across the table at the airline executives with the same steady gaze she had directed at Brittany during the flight, her composure unshaken by the formal setting or the high-stakes nature of the discussion. "Thank you for saying that," she replied, "but I'm less interested in hearing about your company's commitments than I am in seeing evidence of actions that demonstrate those commitments are real rather than just words you use when somebody complains about being treated badly." Diana Foster nodded approvingly at her young client's directness, recognizing that Zara's approach to the negotiation was both strategically sound and morally clear, focusing on substantive outcomes rather than allowing the discussion to be sidetracked by corporate public relations language that often obscured, rather than addressed the underlying problems that needed to be solved. "My client has prepared a detailed analysis of what she experienced during today's flight. Diana said, along with specific recommendations for policy changes that would prevent similar incidents from occurring in the future. I think you'll find her proposals both practical and comprehensive. Jerome Williams had remained quiet during the opening exchange, allowing his daughter to speak for herself while providing the kind of supportive presence that demonstrated his confidence in her ability to handle complex adult discussions. Though his protective instincts were clearly engaged, as he observed the corporate representatives and considered their motivations for participating in these discussions. Zara has been preparing for this kind of responsibility since her mother became ill, he said, addressing the obvious questions about whether a child could meaningfully participate in such serious negotiations. Destiny made sure that she understood both the power and the obligations that come with owning a major business, including the responsibility to treat employees and customers fairly regardless of their personal backgrounds or circumstances. David Rodriguez leaned forward slightly, his legal training helping him navigate the unusual situation of negotiating with someone who would soon have the authority to fire him if the discussions did not proceed to her satisfaction. We understand that the acquisition of SkyWest Holdings by Williams Transport Solutions is scheduled to be finalized this week, he said, and we want to assure you that our entire management team is committed to working constructively with the new ownership structure to address any concerns about employee conduct or company policies. That's good, Zara replied, because the first thing I'm going to do as the new owner is implement a comprehensive review of all passenger complaints filed against airline employees over the past 5 years, with particular attention to cases involving discrimination based on race, age, gender, or socioeconomic status. Any employee with a pattern of validated complaints is going to receive additional training, and employees who continue to treat passengers inappropriately after receiving training are going to be terminated regardless of their union membership or seniority status. Sarah Kim shifted uncomfortably in her seat because Zara's proposed policy changes would directly challenge established labor relations procedures and union protection agreements that had traditionally made it difficult to discipline employees for behavior that fell short of criminal conduct, but created hostile environments for passengers who didn't fit certain demographic expectations. Employment law in the airline industry involves complex collective bargaining agreements and federal labor regulations, she said carefully, and implementing the kind of changes you're describing would require extensive legal review and possibly prolonged negotiations with union representatives. Then we'll start those negotiations immediately, Zara responded, and will make it clear that treating passengers with dignity and respect is not subject to collective bargaining. Either employees can do their jobs while treating all passengers fairly, or they can find employment somewhere else. There are plenty of people who would be grateful for good jobs in the aviation industry, and who understand that customer service means serving all customers, not just the ones who look like they belong in first class. Michael Washington had been taking detailed notes throughout the conversation, recognizing that he was documenting what might become a landmark case in federal civil rights enforcement within the commercial aviation sector. The Transportation Authority will be conducting its own investigation of this incident, he said, including interviews with all witnesses and a comprehensive review of the airline's complaint, handling procedures and employee training programs. Our findings will determine whether federal intervention is necessary to ensure compliance with anti-discrimination laws. Dr. Torres spoke up from his position near the window where he had been observing the psychological dynamics of the negotiation while monitoring Zara's emotional state for signs of stress or fatigue that might require intervention. I think it's important to acknowledge that what we're discussing here isn't just about legal compliance or corporate policies, he said, his voice carrying the moral authority that came from treating children who had been traumatized by adult cruelty. We're talking about whether the airline industry is going to continue allowing employees to inflict psychological harm on young passengers, or whether we're going to create environments where children can travel safely without being subjected to discrimination and abuse. Maya had remained quiet throughout most of the adult discussion, but her presence served as a constant reminder of the human cost of the policies being debated because her friendship with Zara and her witness to the original incident represented the kind of moral clarity that adults often lost when they became focused on legal technicalities and procedural complexities. "Will other kids be safer now?" she asked suddenly, her question cutting through the corporate language and federal regulations to reach the heart of what really mattered. "Yes," Zara said, looking directly at her friend with absolute certainty, "because we're not leaving this room until everyone here agrees to changes that will make sure no child ever has to go through what I went through today. And we're going to put those agreements in writing with specific timelines and consequences for people who don't follow through on their promises." Margaret Chen exchanged glances with her legal colleagues, recognizing that the negotiation was proceeding toward outcomes that would require significant organizational changes and substantial financial investments in training programs, policy development, and complaint resolution procedures. "What specific measures would you like to see implemented?" she asked, her tone suggesting resignation to the reality that Zara's demands would need to be taken seriously, regardless of their cost or complexity. Zara opened her notebook to pages filled with detailed recommendations that demonstrated remarkable foresight and practical understanding of organizational management principles. First, mandatory bias training for all customer-facing employees with annual refresher courses and performance evaluations that specifically measure their ability to treat diverse passengers respectfully. Second, an independent ombudsman office that reports directly to company ownership rather than human resources, so passenger complaints can be investigated without interference from managers who might want to protect problematic employees. Third, financial compensation for passengers who experience discrimination paid personally by the employees responsible rather than by the company, so there are individual consequences for individual choices to treat people badly. The comprehensive nature of Zara's proposals impressed even the most skeptical adults in the room because her recommendations addressed both immediate accountability for the current incident and systematic prevention of future problems through changes that would fundamentally alter the culture of customer service within the airline industry. David Rodriguez was already calculating the legal and financial implications of implementing such policies, while Sarah Kim was considering the practical challenges of retraining hundreds of employees and restructuring complaint resolution procedures that had remained essentially unchanged for decades. "Those are significant commitments," David said, "and implementing them properly will require substantial time and resources. Are you prepared to allow a reasonable timeline for these changes to be developed and implemented, recognizing that transforming organizational culture is a gradual process rather than something that can happen overnight?" "I'm prepared to be reasonable about timelines," Zara replied, "but I'm not prepared to accept delays that are really just excuses for avoiding change. We can start with the easy things immediately, like suspending Brittany Summers, pending a full investigation of her conduct, and requiring all senior staff to attend bias training within 30 days. The more complex changes can be phased in over 6 months, but there has to be visible progress every step of the way, and there have to be real consequences for people who resist or sabotage the implementation process." As the afternoon sunlight faded outside the conference room windows, the participants in this unprecedented negotiation found themselves creating agreements that would reshape passenger protection policies throughout the commercial aviation industry, establishing precedents for corporate accountability and individual responsibility that would influence how airlines treated their most vulnerable customers for years to come. The courage that Zara had demonstrated during a traumatic flight experience was transforming into systematic change that would protect countless future passengers from experiencing the discrimination and abuse that had been allowed to persist for far too long in an industry that had prioritized operational efficiency over human dignity. 1 month after the incident aboard Flight 1847, Zara Williams stood in the executive conference room of her newly acquired airline headquarters in San Francisco. looking out through floor-to-ceiling windows at the runways where aircraft took off and landed with the same routine efficiency that had characterized commercial aviation for decades. Though the policies governing passenger treatment and employee conduct had been revolutionized through changes that were already being studied and replicated by airlines throughout the industry. The room itself had been redesigned to reflect values that honored both professional excellence and human dignity, with Destiny's restored photograph occupying a place of honor, beside certificates recognizing the company's improved safety ratings and customer satisfaction scores. The transformation of SkyWest Airlines had proceeded with remarkable speed and thoroughness, driven by Zara's combination of moral clarity and practical authority that allowed her to implement changes that might have taken years to achieve through traditional corporate channels or regulatory pressure. Brittany Summers had been terminated following an investigation that revealed a pattern of discriminatory behavior toward passengers that extended far beyond the incident that had finally brought her conduct to light. Though her dismissal was accompanied by an offer of counseling and retraining that reflected Zara's belief that accountability should include opportunities for personal growth and redemption, rather than simply punishment and exclusion. Riley Johnson had been promoted to Director of Passenger Relations, a newly created position that gave her authority to investigate complaints and implement policy changes without interference from union representatives or management officials who might be more concerned with protecting problematic employees than ensuring fair treatment of passengers. Her transition from junior flight attendant to senior leadership had been remarkable not just for its speed, but for the respect she had earned from colleagues who recognized that her courage in documenting Brittany's misconduct had made positive change possible for everyone in the organization. The mandatory bias training program that Zara had insisted upon during the airport conference room, negotiations had been completed by all customer-facing employees within the promised 30-day timeline, with follow-up sessions scheduled quarterly to reinforce principles of inclusive service and respectful communication. Early results suggested that the training was having measurable effects on both employee behavior and passenger satisfaction, with complaint rates dropping significantly and positive feedback increasing across all demographic categories. Though Zara understood that cultural change was a long-term process that would require sustained attention and continuous improvement, Maya Rodriguez had become a regular visitor to the airline headquarters, her friendship with Zara having evolved into something approaching a mentorship relationship where the 9-year-old served as both moral compass and practical advisor on policies affecting children and families. Her insights about how airlines could better serve young passengers had led to the creation of specialized training for flight crews, working with unaccompanied minors, along with child-friendly amenities and communication procedures that recognized the unique needs and concerns of travelers who were still developing their understanding of adult institutions and social expectations. Dr. Samuel Torres had volunteered to serve on an advisory committee focusing on the psychological impact of discriminatory treatment on passengers, particularly children who might be traveling alone or with family members who lacked the resources or knowledge to seek appropriate remedies when they experienced unfair treatment. His medical expertise had been instrumental in developing policies that recognized trauma as a legitimate concern, requiring institutional response, rather than individual resilience, leading to the creation of counseling services and support programs for passengers who had been subjected to discrimination or abuse. Diana Foster had been retained as the airline's external counsel for civil rights matters, her role expanding beyond legal compliance to include policy development and training design that would prevent discrimination rather than simply responding to it after it occurred. Her experience with federal civil rights law had been invaluable in ensuring that the airline's new policies met the highest standards for protecting passenger rights, while also providing clear guidance for employees who wanted to do their jobs effectively without inadvertently creating hostile environments for customers from diverse backgrounds. Harrison Walsh had surprised everyone, including himself, by using his business connections and financial resources to establish a foundation supporting young entrepreneurs from underrepresented communities who wanted to pursue careers in transportation and logistics. His transformation from comfortable bystander to active ally had been gradual but genuine, motivated by his recognition that privilege carried responsibilities that extended beyond personal success to include creating opportunities for others to achieve their own dreams and ambitions, despite facing barriers that more fortunate individuals never encountered. Captain Patterson had been promoted to Chief of Flight Operations, his leadership during the crisis having demonstrated qualities that went beyond technical competence to include moral courage and commitment to treating all passengers with dignity and respect. His personal connection to Destiny Williams had given him unique insights into the kind of organizational culture that Zara wanted to create, where employees understood that their primary responsibility was serving people rather than protecting corporate interests or maintaining hierarchical advantages that privilege some customers over others. The independent ombudsman office that Zara had demanded during the negotiations had been established with full authority to investigate passenger complaints without interference from management or union representatives, creating a transparent accountability system that allowed problems to be addressed quickly and fairly, rather than being buried in bureaucratic procedures designed to minimize corporate liability. Early cases had demonstrated the effectiveness of having neutral investigators who were empowered to recommend appropriate remedies, including financial compensation, employee discipline, and policy changes that addressed systematic problems rather than just individual incidents. Jerome Williams had taken pride in watching his daughter navigate the complex responsibilities of corporate leadership while maintaining the values and principles that Destiny had instilled in her throughout her childhood, though he remained protective of her well-being and insisted that she continue her education and maintain friendships with other children her age, despite the extraordinary demands of running a major business enterprise. His role had evolved from sole parent to trusted advisor, helping Zara balance the competing demands of academic achievement, social development, and corporate responsibility that would shape her understanding of herself and her place in the world. The broader impact of Zara's actions had extended far beyond SkyWest Airlines to influence policy discussions throughout the transportation industry, with federal regulators citing her case as evidence that current complaint resolution procedures were inadequate to address discrimination and abuse experienced by passengers who lacked the resources or authority to demand accountability from large corporations. Legislative proposals for enhanced passenger protection had gained momentum partly because Zara's story demonstrated both the prevalence of discriminatory treatment and the possibility of creating meaningful change when victims had sufficient power to demand justice, rather than simply accepting mistreatment as inevitable. Media coverage of the incident and its aftermath had focused primarily on the positive changes that had resulted from Zara's courage and determination, though some critics had questioned whether an 11-year-old should be allowed to control a major airline regardless of her intelligence and moral commitment. Zara had responded to such concerns by pointing out that adults had been managing the airline industry for decades without preventing the kind of discrimination she had experienced, suggesting that age was less important than values when it came to creating organizations that treated all people with dignity and respect. As Zara stood in her conference room, looking out at the airport operations that were now under her ultimate authority, she felt the complex mixture of pride and responsibility that came with having transformed personal trauma into systematic change that would benefit countless future passengers. The photograph of Destiny had been professionally restored and now sat in an elegant new frame that honored both the memory it preserved and the vision it represented, a reminder that love and loss could be channeled into actions that created healing and protection for others who faced similar challenges and injustices. 6 months after the transformation of SkyWest Airlines began, Zara Williams found herself sitting in a congressional hearing room in Washington, D.C., preparing to testify before the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee about passenger rights and corporate accountability in the commercial aviation industry. The formal setting, with its polished wood paneling, marble columns, and television cameras, represented the kind of public platform that most business leaders spent years trying to access. Though Zara's presence there had resulted not from political connections or lobbying efforts, but from the moral authority she had earned through her response to discrimination and her commitment to creating lasting change rather than accepting personal compensation and moving on. Beside her sat Jerome, dressed in his best suit and carrying the same mixture of pride and protective concern that had characterized his parenting since Destiny's death. While behind them in the gallery were many of the people who had witnessed or participated in the events that had led to this moment. Maya Rodriguez had traveled from Detroit with her mother specifically to watch her friend address Congress, her presence serving as a reminder that children's voices deserved to be heard in discussions about policies that affected their safety and well-being. Dr. Torres, Diana Foster, Captain Patterson, and even Harrison Walsh had taken time from their busy schedules to support Zara's testimony, their attendance reflecting the lasting relationships that had grown from their shared experience of witnessing injustice and choosing to take action rather than remaining comfortable bystanders. The committee room was filled with transportation industry representatives, civil rights advocates, federal regulators, and journalists who understood that Zara's testimony could influence legislation affecting millions of passengers who traveled on commercial airlines each year. Though what made her appearance particularly noteworthy was not just her age, but the comprehensive nature of the changes she had implemented and the measurable results those changes had produced in terms of improved customer satisfaction and reduced complaint rates across multiple demographic categories. Committee Chair Representative Sarah Martinez had opened the hearing by acknowledging the unusual circumstances that had brought such a young witness before Congress, while emphasizing that age should not diminish the significance of someone's experiences or the value of their insights when it came to creating policies that protected all Americans from discrimination and abuse. We are here today to examine how commercial airlines can better serve passengers from diverse backgrounds, she had said, and we have invited Ms. Williams to share her experiences, both as someone who was subjected to discriminatory treatment and as someone who has successfully implemented solutions that address these problems at the corporate level. When Zara was called to testify, she approached the witness table with the same composed dignity she had maintained throughout her ordeal on Flight 1847 and the subsequent negotiations that had transformed airline policies, though, speaking to members of Congress, represented a new level of public responsibility that required her to articulate not just her personal experiences, but also her vision for industry-wide reform. Her prepared statement had been carefully crafted with Diana Foster's assistance to ensure legal accuracy while maintaining the moral clarity that had made her such an effective advocate for passenger rights. Distinguished members of the committee, Zara began her voice carrying clearly through the formal chamber, despite her youth. My name is Zara Williams, and I am here today not just as the CEO of SkyWest Airlines, but as an 11-year-old girl who learned firsthand what it feels like to be treated differently because of the color of my skin and my age, and who decided that no other child should have to experience that kind of discrimination when they're just trying to travel from one place to another. She spoke for 20 minutes without notes describing the incident on Flight 1847 with the same factual precision she had used in corporate negotiations, but also conveying the emotional impact of having her mother's photograph destroyed and being subjected to harassment and humiliation in front of passengers who initially chose to remain silent rather than speaking up for what was right. Her testimony was compelling not because it was dramatic or sensational, but because it was honest and specific, providing concrete examples of how discrimination manifested in everyday situations and how individual choices by employees and bystanders either perpetuated or challenged patterns of unfair treatment. The most important thing I learned from this experience, Zara continued, is that discrimination isn't usually dramatic or obvious. It's often small things that add up to make people feel unwelcome or unworthy, like questioning someone's right to be somewhere without any real reason or treating their personal belongings as less valuable than other people's property, or assuming that silence means acceptance, when what it really means is that people don't know how to speak up or are afraid of making things worse for themselves or others. Maya watched from the gallery with rapt attention, proud of her friend's courage and articulation, but also thinking about how this moment connected to the conversations they had shared about fairness and friendship during their flight to San Francisco. Conversations that had helped both children understand that adults didn't always know how to handle difficult situations and sometimes needed guidance from younger people who hadn't yet learned to accept injustice as normal or inevitable. The questions from committee members were respectful and substantive, focusing on the practical aspects of implementing anti-discrimination policies in large organizations and the measurable results that SkyWest Airlines had achieved through its comprehensive approach to cultural change. Representative James Wilson, the ranking minority member, asked about the financial costs of the training programs and policy changes, while Representative Lisa Chen wanted to know whether the improvements in passenger satisfaction had been accompanied by corresponding improvements in employee morale and job satisfaction. The changes cost money to implement. Zara acknowledged, but treating people fairly isn't really a business expense. It's an investment in creating the kind of organization that attracts good employees and loyal customers, because people want to work for companies that share their values, and they want to spend money with businesses that treat them with respect. We've actually saved money by reducing employee turnover and legal expenses while gaining customers who choose us specifically because they know we're committed to treating everyone well. Jerome watched his daughter field complex questions from experienced politicians and policy experts with the same calm competence she brought to corporate board meetings and media interviews. Though he knew that underneath her public composure was still an 11-year-old girl who missed her mother and carried the weight of responsibilities that would challenge most adults. Destiny would have been proud not just of Zara's achievements, but of the grace and humility she maintained despite her extraordinary circumstances, never allowing success or recognition to diminish her commitment to helping other people, or her understanding that privilege created obligations to serve, rather than simply to accumulate wealth or status. The hearing concluded with Representative Martinez thanking Zara for her testimony and announcing that the committee would be drafting comprehensive passenger protection legislation based partly on the policies that had proven effective at SkyWest Airlines, though she emphasized that creating lasting change would require sustained effort from industry leaders, federal regulators, and passengers themselves, who needed to speak up when they witnessed discrimination, rather than hoping someone else would take responsibility for addressing problems. As Zara left the congressional hearing room, surrounded by supporters who had become friends and allies through their shared commitment to justice and accountability, she reflected on how far they had all traveled since that morning when she had boarded Flight 1847, carrying her mother's photograph and her own hopes for completing the business transaction that Destiny had envisioned. The acquisition of SkyWest Airlines had been finalized exactly as planned, but the personal and professional relationships that had grown from the crisis had created something much more valuable than corporate success or financial gain. That evening, as Zara sat in her Washington hotel room writing in the same leather notebook that had sustained her through the original incident, she composed another letter to her mother, describing the day's testimony and the ongoing work of creating institutions that honored both individual dignity and collective responsibility. "Mama," she wrote, "I think you would be proud of how we're using the power you worked so hard to give me. It's not just about owning a company or making money. It's about making sure that power serves love instead of fear, and that love wins." 2 years later, SkyWest Airlines had become the industry standard for inclusive passenger service, with discrimination complaints dropping to nearly zero and customer satisfaction scores reaching unprecedented levels. The Destiny Williams Protocol for passenger protection had been adopted by major airlines nationwide, creating comprehensive frameworks that transformed abstract commitments to equality into concrete policies with measurable outcomes and meaningful consequences. Maya Rodriguez had become Zara's youngest board advisor at age 11, while their friendship continued to demonstrate that authentic relationships could flourish across differences in background and circumstance when people shared fundamental values about treating each other with kindness and respect. Their collaboration on youth advocacy initiatives had inspired similar programs at companies throughout the transportation industry, proving that children's perspectives could provide valuable guidance for adults who had lost sight of basic principles of fairness and human dignity. The ripple effects of courage displayed by passengers and crew members during a single flight had grown into a movement that touched millions of lives, demonstrating that individual choices to speak up against injustice could create lasting change when people were willing to move beyond comfortable silence into active solidarity with those who faced discrimination and abuse. Riley Johnson's decision to document misconduct. Dr. Torres's commitment to protecting children's psychological well-being. Diana Foster's legal expertise, Harrison Walsh's philanthropic support, and Captain Patterson's leadership had all contributed to systemic transformation that honored the memory of a woman whose business philosophy had always emphasized treating people with dignity regardless of their position or power. Zara Williams, now 13 and still attending regular school while managing one of America's most successful airlines, kept her mother's photograph in every boardroom where she advocated for policies that protected vulnerable passengers and empowered employees to do the right thing, even when it required personal courage and professional risk. "She's still teaching me," Zara would tell reporters who asked about her motivation for continuing activism that extended far beyond corporate profits. "Love wins, but sometimes it needs a little help from people who refuse to stay silent when they witness injustice."